Hello friends, AmyR here with another set of cards and video. Today I am playing with more alcohol inks. I did a video not too long ago using some alcohol inks, and it's one of those things again when you start pulling them out again, start playing with them, it's like, oh, these are fun. So I am working with Yupo paper again. This time this is Yupo heavy stock. Highly recommend heavy stock if you want to do heat embossing, which is kind of the main point with these cards. You can heat emboss with regular Yupo paper as well. However, it's thinner. It starts getting a lot finicky. Like, it's just, yeah. It's called paper, you know, Yupo paper. It's not actually paper. Yupo paper, it's a specialty product. It's basically a form of plastic. So using the heavy stock, it's thicker. It's a little more resistant to the heat. I'll get to that in a minute. Also, for these sort of alcohol ink techniques, I highly recommend the Yupo paper. People ask if regular cardstock will work. Regular cardstock, no. Glossy photo paper, maybe. I've seen videos. There's people that do these sort of techniques like on canvas. I don't know. I can't speak to any of that because I don't work on canvases. I know it won't work on regular cardstock. Glossy photo paper, you're not going to get the same results, but if that's what you've got, why not try it? You know, see what works for you. The most key things to remember when working with alcohol inks, like I listed on the screen, is a well ventilated area, always with, you know, any sort of alcohol products. It's just well ventilated area. I highly recommend working on a glass work surface. It doesn't have to be the glass media mat here, this Tonic one. This is the travel one, by the way. This fits on my little bitty work surface. The full-size one, not so much. I love them both, but you don't need both either. A glass work surface, though, because it's just the easiest to clean up after. If you don't have that, some just things that you don't mind getting wrecked, you know, scrap paper, that sort of a thing, because just alcohol inks will just stain everything. Even like the non-stick craft mats we like to use, alcohol inks will stain those. So anywho. So those are the important things. The other thing I really recommend, I love that black little tool I'm holding. That's the Holtz alcohol ink blower. Game changer. I have a couple other tools I've used, you know, since I started playing with alcohol inks. I have my little, you know, marker spritzer, which is similar. I also have a little blower that's similar to this, that's meant to like clean the lenses on your cameras and stuff, but it's just smaller. This, because it's so much larger, it's just easier on the hands. Oh, so much better. So anywho, all that chatter while I was doing these backgrounds, I was just playing with the first background, like just laying down inks and mixative and just making a huge mess, but having fun. And then I had a bunch of ink all over my glass media mat there, which you can clean it up. I'll show how I clean it up in a second here. But I kept adding the alcohol blending solution and then just basically kind of ink smushing like we do with our regular inks. And I got another background out of it. I'm not going to use it on today's cards, but I've got a background out of it. Again, alcohol inks, they're fun to play with. You know, just start experimenting and see, you know, try the different substrates, the different types of, you know, there's Yupo papers, there's all translucent Yupo paper, there's black. We have the sparkly paper that Holtz has as well. Photo paper, glossy card, like there's all kinds of different things to try. So I did 2 different colorways here, and I'll link to each little pack. I'd bought these new colors were released a year ago or whenever it was. It's time to pull them out. This background, when I started experimenting, I was starting to get more of the results I was wanting in my head. And this one was achieved. I put down like 3 big puddles of alcohol blending solution and then dropped the colors in the center of them and then started moving things around with the ink blower. And then I went in and added mixative. The colors with the greens, I used a silver mixative. With this one, I'm using gold. When it comes to using the mixatives, shake the ever-living heck out of them. Literally. There are little metal shaker balls in the mixatives because there's pigments in them and the pigments settle to the bottom. But you want to shake them until you hear this. Right now, you don't hear it. And then once you loosen, right there, you'll hear that little shaker ball. You want to shake your mixatives until you loosen that little shaker ball, and then literally shake. Just shake the daylights out of it. Make sure the lid is on really good. But mixatives you need to shake up really, really well before each use because the pigments just settle. They behave differently than the alcohol inks. They move and the pigments go all over the place, and they're just, again, one of those things where you just gotta play with. So that's what I did. I used the silver mixative with the greens, and then I'm using this gold mixative with these blues. And I've got myself, and I ended up with 3 backgrounds. I'm going to use 2 of them here. This heavyweight Yupo heavy stock, whatever, my brain's not working. White heavy stock Yupo paper is 5 by 7 inches. I ended up cutting them in half and then cutting them down just a little bit more because I wasn't paying attention when I was cutting. So I had to trim them a tiny bit more, but I ended up trimming them down to roughly 3. They were 3.5, so a little over 3 1/4 by about 4 3/4 roughly. I just trimmed them down from just cutting in half and then just trimmed down a tiny bit more to kind of cut off the edges because on the green especially I had like some smears on the one edge. So I just trimmed them down a little bit. So they'll be much smaller than in my A2 card fronts, but I was fine with that. But then this way I got 4 card fronts out of this. So now I'm going to heat emboss on these. Again, Yupo paper isn't paper, it is plastic. So heat embossing, I like to just be overly cautious with all things. But when it comes to working with like alcohol inks and these sorts of products and all that, I just, one, common sense, 2, just caution. So I'm going to stamp on them like I normally do. I used my MISTI here. I have this XOXO background, this red rubber background from Simon Says Stamp. This stamp is currently, as of doing this voiceover, on sale. I will have links, as always, in the description box below the video. But I used my anti-static powder tool on my background. I inked up the stamp with clear embossing ink, stamped onto this background, and then coated that stamped image with silver embossing powder. Once it was coated, I let my heat tool heat up. And with this, it starts to warp just like regular cardstock. But again, this isn't regular cardstock. This will melt. Like the actual Yupo itself will melt. It'll start to curl and it will melt. So you bring heat to it carefully. I just bring enough, let your heat tool heat up really, really well. And then I just bring it, to each little area. And the second the embossing powder is melted, I remove the heat. That's it. That's all you got to do. So that's why the heavyweight works a lot better. The regular Yupo paper, thinner Yupo papers, etc., they just can't handle that heat. The heat needed to melt the embossing powder will melt the Yupo paper faster than the embossing powder. So using the heavyweight Yupo paper helps a lot. Regardless, it does warp pretty much no matter what. It might not if you're doing like maybe a different image, like a really fine lined image, with just thin lines. You could probably get a good result, or just not as big as a entire background stamp. But this was pretty solid, but it still worked. Again, you just got to experiment. So I was able to do it with this. I just kept moving my heat tool around, bringing it to the background, melting a bit, moving it, that sort of thing, moving it around, not letting it sit for too long on one area to melt that Yupo paper. So with the green backgrounds, I did the silver embossing powder. With the blue ones, I'm using gold embossing powder. I was heavily inspired by a card that Nina Marie Trapani posted not too long ago. She did an alcohol ink background with like pinks and purples. It was fabulous. And then she used this background stamp with gold embossing powder, and the combo it's gorgeous. I will link to her blog post in my blog post because I was totally inspired. I loved how she had stamped this background on an angle, so it really showed that little heart in the corner, and just the alcohol ink background, all of it, and the splatter, because I'm going to add splatter to this, which I normally never would have thought of adding to an alcohol ink background. But she did it, and I was like, it's perfect. Like, I need an excuse to add splatter. So I have on my backgrounds. They're all melted. Again, they're a bit warped, but that'll be fine when I go to adhere them to my cards. For my splatter, I'm just using some Picket Fence white distress paint. I just shake it up really well, put a little bit onto my plastic palette. I added a bit of water. You don't need to add water, but I didn't want it to be really intense white. So I added a bit of water and then splattered this onto my backgrounds. whatever you splatter, if it's the, paint, the distress paint, or, you use a spray, splatter spray, any of those sorts of things, because you're adding this on top of an alcohol ink background that's already on a Yupo, like a plastic, it's not paper, this will take longer to dry. Like usually distress paint, when I splatter things, it's dry really quickly because it's, kind of absorbs into the paper, it evaporates, it dries, everything's good. Because these are plastic, it takes a lot longer. And I was impatient. So I end up using like some scratch paper when I'm adhering things and that, because I didn't have the time or the patience to let them dry for as long as they need. But yeah, just another little FYI, if you're splattering, paint and that sort of thing on top of Yupo paper or alcohol ink in general, because it just creates a more solid barrier. So I did my splattering, set all that aside, and then I pulled out the coordinating wafer die set for the Botanical Heart stamp set. That stamp set is also on sale, so I'll link to it as well, because there's a bunch of really good sale items, and I'll link to that whole category in the description box below the video. It's just a limited time sort of a thing. But the coordinating wafer die set has this great little Love You wafer die in there. So I pulled that out and I die cut black cardstock as well as some silver cardstock and some gold cardstock from it. And I just layered the black cardstock die cuts onto just pieces of black cardstock. And then with the silver and the gold, I just took the letters and the little frame die cuts and adhered that right over top. I could have inlaid them instead, but for whatever reason, I decided I didn't want to do inlay today. I just wanted to adhere them on top. Gave it a little bit more dimension, not a lot. So I just used little tiny dabs of craft tacky glue. And this ends up like watching this as I'm like doing my voiceover. This looks a lot more finicky than it felt, especially doing it 4 times. But it didn't take very long. I just used little thin little bits of adhesive, adhered everything, and then adhered the letters, adhered the frame, and then just repeated that process until I have 4 of these die cuts that all say Love You. And then set those aside, splatter's still drying. So I'm going to do the insides of my cards. So my card bases are top folding A2 white cardstock. And that XOXO background was still in my MISTI. So I put the card base into my MISTI, and I'm just using scrap paper to mask off the top portion of the card past the fold. And then I'm just inking up the stamp with Dusty Sage ink from Simon. And then I'm going to do this twice for the 2 card bases. And then I'm going to use Audrey blue ink for the other 2 card bases. And just keeping it simple. That's all I'm going to use. Again, I liked it on the angle. It's funny how, for me, that's really not something I normally think of. I love seeing other designers do stuff like that, because I'm very, I have OCD, and I am very, linear. I think, straight lines, that sort of a thing. So even just, tilting something like this on an angle is not something I would normally consider. And then I see other people do it, and I'm like, I like that a lot. So anyway, I did that with all of my card bases, so they're all stamped with that big background, and that's it. I'm not going to add any other sentiments. Just like with all my other cards from my Valentine's series, even though they have XOXO, love you, love sentiments, that sort of a thing, these are very open-ended. These are the types of cards I would use to just say thank you, thinking of you, etc. So I have my card bases stamped. I have the main die cut sentiment, and then I pulled out the tiny words stamp set and stamped one of the sentiments from it with some VersaFine Claire Nocturne ink just onto some white cardstock. And then I'm going to die cut that with the smallest of the sentiment label wafer dice. And then I'm just going to use my paper trimmer to trim down the ends so they're more even. So I'll have all my cards will just say love you, you're the best, which is perfect for a thank you card in my opinion. So after I've got all of my little sentiments, I'm going to adhere them to all of these card fronts with some foam tape. Again, this is where things get a little finicky because the Yupo paper is a little bit warped from the heat embossing. And then also I have the problem of the white paint splatter. It's still a little bit wet. Thankfully, I didn't really smear it. It's not noticeable from looking at them. Whatever I did end up smearing, because I did, you can't really tell, which is the beauty of, you know, alcohol ink backgrounds, because there's splatter and movement and all that kind of stuff going on anyway. But yeah, so once I've got my sentiments adhered, I then placed Big Mama foam tape on the back of all of these alcohol ink panels. Foam tape is a great way to help when you've got, regardless of whether it's alcohol ink or if you did like watercolor backgrounds or like anything that you got wet, like heavy inking, that sort of a thing, and the cardstock warps. Foam tape is a great way to just get it to adhere as flat as possible. So I did that. And then after I removed the backing from the foam tape, I used my Craft Tacky glue. I've shown this in other videos. This just gives me some wiggle room. I used way too much glue. I don't know what I was thinking. My brain just was out the window at this point. You don't need that much glue. Just a little squiggle of glue is great. It gives you some wiggle room before, you know, the foam tape fully adheres, because foam tape, the second it's pressed down, it ain't going anywhere. So I got those adhered to my card bases, and I kind of like that the alcohol ink backgrounds are smaller, so then the card base really frames those alcohol ink backgrounds. And then as a final little bit of embellishment, I didn't want to add, you know, too much because I've got a lot going on with the splatter and the alcohol ink and heat embossing and all that stuff. But I'm using some opal confetti from Trinity Stamps, and it just kind of pulls everything together because the opal just kind of reflects the colors that are on the backgrounds. So I had adhered those into place with some dabs of Craft Tacky glue, and that finished off these cards. So like I mentioned earlier in the video, I will have a link to my blog post directly below the video, and I'll have a supply list. I'll link to everything as well directly below, and then on my blog it's picture links, so you can check out all that info in the description box below the video. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting. I really appreciate it. I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!